The next session is really bursting with alpha. It's called These Are Ectogames. It's a presentation. It's going to be a video presentation because, fortunately, where Kevin is from, it's like 6 a.m. now, so he had to pre-record this. But there's been a genre of NFT projects that have come out over the last year or so, which Kevin Buist describes as Ectogames. And he says that Ectogames are NFT projects that offer elements of games but lack the organizing form of a game, right? And so an example of this would be something like Loot, if any of you have come across this. So Kevin is an independent critic, curator, design strategist, and former artistic director of Art Prize, where he oversaw artists, operations, and design. He holds an MA in Visual and Critical Studies from the Kendall College of Art and Design. This is about a 16-minute video. It's not that long, but as I say, it's really, really fascinating, and I think is very important in terms of the role that gamification, video games, game worlds play in this whole space. Straight after Kevin's video finishes, we'll then have our last session, which is called This is the Way, Part 1, and involves 3 of the platforms who are exhibiting on Art Dubai Digital, but specifically the ones that come from or connected to this nebulous term, the Global South. And that will be our last session for the Global Art Forum, and then we'll shift into the Bybit talks after that. But just in terms of where we are on the timeline, this is our penultimate presentation, and there'll be one more after that. So if we could play Kevin's clip. And I don't know if there's a way to turn the lights down a bit in the room.
My name is Kevin Buist. I'm an independent critic and curator and design strategist living in Grand Rapids, Michigan, USA. This talk is called These Are Ectogames. And I want to thank Shimon Bissar for inviting me to give this talk. This talk is based on an essay that I wrote for Outland.art, which is an online magazine about crypto, blockchain, and other digital art practices. The title of the essay is What's Their Game? But this talk is called These Are Ectogames. Ectogames is a term that I came up with while I was trying to figure out if there was anything actually novel, really truly new happening in the emerging NFT space. And I was noticing that so many people who were really excited about NFTs and who were making them and who were talking about them, especially in early 2021, seemed to be excited about ideas that had actually existed for a long time. Things like conceptual art that relies on contracts. We know that Yves Klein and Marcel Duchamp did that nearly a century ago, or even just things like certificates of authenticity or a market for digital art. Like these things have already existed. They may have not gotten quite as much popular attention as NFTs are getting now, but they're not new. So I just set about thinking is there anything about this activity that is truly new? And I noticed this interesting thing happening, which I termed ectogames. And so ectogames, ecto is a prefix that means outside of, ectoplasm means to spew plasm outside of the body, right? So ectogames are projects that have some of the elements of games, but they exist without the container of a game, without the organizing logic or principles of what we think of as a game. And so there's this kind of game-like quality to them, but they're not games. And I also want to draw the distinction between ectogames and gamification, which of course has been had its heyday as sort of the new term of the moment with kind of internet engagement maybe 10 years ago. But gamification is taking game-like qualities, play, points, goals, things like that, and layering them on top of things that are not games. And ectogames are distinct from that. It's not gamification. There are also games that use blockchain technology to build reward systems and the exchange of digital goods within the games. Things like the Sandbox, Lightbringer, and Axie Infinity are all blockchain-based games. But I also would make a distinction that those are not ectogames. Those are games, they're video games as we understand them that are just making use of blockchain technology. Even the word game can be slippery when you get into things like game theory and other applications of the word game. So when I say game, I mean structured play, things that offer frameworks that connect many elements as in a cultural artifact. And so those could include characters, depictions of objects and actions, imagined worlds, as well as the rules that govern those interactions with those elements between each other and between the players and the actions of the players. So that understanding of games accounts for everything from chess to Pokemon to Call of Duty. So Ectogames, on the other hand, invert the logic of the game. They have some of those aforementioned game elements, but no unifying framework that structures play. A 2x2 matrix can be used to illustrate how art, games, and this emerging form of ectogames all relate to each other. The y-axis, the vertical axis, describes how structured and specific the formal, conceptual, and historical qualities of a cultural artifact or activity tend to be. And this ranges from undefined forms at the bottom to defined forms at the top. The x-axis, the horizontal axis, charts how clear the role of the audience or viewer or player is in relation to the artifact or activity. And this goes on a spectrum from undefined participation on the left to defined participation on the right. So the y-axis is concerned with what the cultural form is, while the x-axis is concerned with what one does with it. This results in 4 quadrants. In the quadrant of defined forms and undefined participation, on the upper left, we find fine art like painting and sculpture. The form of these artifacts is very clearly defined, has a really deep and rich history, but exactly how the viewer engages with painting and sculpture is usually quite ambiguous. There are no instructions. You decide when you're done. There's no way to win looking at a painting. The upper right quadrant is where we find defined forms and defined participation. And this is where we find games as we know them and as we are familiar with them. So games follow established structures with a well-defined internal logic. The possibilities for a player's interaction with the game are often quite narrowly defined. Board games come with a set of rules. Video games only allow certain player character actions. Both board games and video games have really clearly established goals and limits. In the bottom left quadrant, we find undefined forms and undefined participation. And this is where we find experimental artistic practices like happenings, social sculpture, and relational artworks. Think things like Rick Venetia cooking a meal or Alan Caprouse happenings, things like that. What form the artifact or activity should take here is unbound by artistic tradition. The audience's role is similarly open to a wide range of possibilities. It may involve participation, it may not. And finally, in the bottom right quadrant is where we find defined participation with undefined forms. And this is where we place this new term of ectogames. So participants in ectogames behave like players in a game. They develop characters, they claim loot, they form communities, they collaborate on lore and fan art and maps and other user-generated content that typically stems from an established game. But they do all of this without the structure of a game. Plotting out this 2x2 matrix also allows us to, locate specific cultural artifacts, games, artworks, or even art forms, kind of in their level of extremity to sort of how far they get into that corner. So, like in the upper left quadrant, and this is all very speculative, and really my hope with this is that it's open to argument and debate. And what I would love more than anything is for people online to tell me that I placed these specific examples, somehow in the wrong place, and that they should be moved up or down or right or left, because the debate around that is really rewarding to me. But I would put fine art, like painting, as in like the sort of upper echelon of fine art, super defined form, very undefined participation. Whereas something like cinema, the form is very well defined, but exactly how you participate is actually quite a lot more structured than a painting, right? It doesn't require as much of you as a game, but a movie does have a clear beginning and end, and you kind of know what you're supposed to do when you're looking at it. A couple of other examples in the upper right category. Not all games are created equal, and they exist at very different spots in this spectrum. AAA video games are sort of the big studio, big budget games that really drive the video game industry. Those, along with board games, are what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the fact that games have quite a lot of structure and sort of limited possibility for users to deviate. Whereas something like Dungeons and Dragons is has rules, but the goals are really much more open for the players to figure out what their goals are, and they're kind of building a story on their own, right? Something like Minecraft, it's a 3D virtual world like many games are, but there's not a clear way to win in a lot of the ways that people play Minecraft. It's much more of a sandbox, right? Many Ectogames are a work in progress. One example is Blitmap, which is a community-crafted sci-fi universe. It began with on-chain pixel art and then expanded into collectible characters called Blitnauts. Every month they're updating more and more where this project is headed. Another really great example, and one that really made me start to think critically about this idea, is called Loot for Adventurers. Loot consists of 8,000 really simple NFTs. Each one of them is just a black square with a list of white text on it. And that text is a list of randomized fantasy gear. So these are the kinds of things that you might find in Dungeons and Dragons or World of Warcraft or Skyrim. But there is no game officially associated with any of this. Despite that, users have built worlds around it. They've made their own art, their own lore, dozens of compatible spin-off projects. It's worth noting that Bitmap and Loot are both the creation of Dom Hoffman, who is the co-creator of the video social network called Vine. Hoffman is really prolific, but he's certainly not the only one who's forging new ground in this space. A project called Lost Poets by the artist Pack is an ever-evolving NFT collectible and strategy ectogame that's forming over a series of acts. Forgotten Runes Wizard Cult is another great example of an ectogame, which is a collection of 10,000 pixel art wizards. And it's really buoyed by this incredible community that has come around collecting these NFTs. And that community is just feverishly writing lore and backstories for their characters, creating their own role-playing games in chat rooms, and coming up with like the world in which the wizards live. Forgotten Runes Wizard Cult has actually announced plans to make a real computer game, starring these NFT little pixel art creations as the playable characters within the game. Some of these things might actually be sort of like an ectogame as a temporary state for a project that then evolves into what we would more clearly define as a game. And so I think Forgotten Runes Wizard Cult is one of those where, when I wrote the piece, it was sort of an archetypal ectogame, and now it's quickly becoming what we would just refer to as a game. If we cast the parameters of ectogames a bit wider, I think that you could kind of make the argument that profile picture NFT series, such as CryptoPunks and Bored Ape Yacht Club, Cryptodes, all of those, they also resemble ectogames in a certain sense. Like they're kind of boundless games, right? Players / collectors, take on the role of these characters. They form communities. And they either actively or passively wait for the structure of the game to become more clear. So the bulk of the NFT market and most ectogames are currently on the Ethereum blockchain. And unlike Bitcoin, Ethereum was designed to be more than a distributed ledger for a digital currency. It is a digital currency, but the code base which makes it up allows for much, much more. So Ethereum and other blockchains like it can exchange much more complex tokens, and the smart contracts can execute functions with code in ways that Bitcoin cannot. So NFTs are often criticized for not being actual art objects, right? Like they're just the certificates of authenticity, pointing to an image file that's saved somewhere else. And although this is true of most NFTs, the potential exists for smart contracts to do way more than that, such as creating generative art through code and operating as dynamic game elements. So the NFTs that make up the projects like Blipmap and Lost Poets and Forgotten Runes Wizard Cult are all subject to various transformations as the narrative evolves and as those fictional worlds are fleshed out. So a Forgotten Runes Wizard Cult NFT, for example, yes, it's a cute image of a wizard, but it actually can undergo transformations, and that image can change, and it can have these different sort of state changes. And this is all happening even before the actual game of Forgotten Runes has been created. There is no game yet. They're still very much in Ectogame territory. So Ectogames are emerging in this current flurry of experimentation and speculation that's happening in the NFT space. And it's driven on the one hand by a lot of money and a lot of people making big bets and making and losing a lot of money, but it's also driven by artists and creative technologists who are really thinking in novel ways about what this technology enables. Blockchain technology may not strictly be a prerequisite for Ectogames to exist, but I think that the future-oriented attitude of the people who are investing their time and energy and money into NFTs, I think that their attitude lends itself really well to the idea of acquiring game elements that exist outside of game frameworks. It's a bit of a speculative activity for anyone participating, and this is a very speculative space. So participants in Ectogames, they're all betting that a game or something like it will form around the elements that they are currently beginning to own and collect. And they're betting that those elements will hold or gain value when that happens. So what I would consider to be like a true Ectogames is probably a small subset of the overall NFT market. I do think that it's an important concept to delineate because it captures the spirit of the entire scene. And they may offer a clearer picture of where things are headed than just the sale of collectible JPEGs. So everyone who's purchasing NFTs of any kind, from digital art collectors to decentralized finance bros who are trying to buy their way into Bored Ape Yacht Club, they're all making the same bet that there's a new game or a new way of existing and making money on the internet, and that new paradigm will form around them, and that they will be the early adopters who owned a piece of it before it was fully formed. I think that there's no guarantee that will happen, or it may happen in a way that turns out to be quite different than what a lot of people are predicting. It's really hard to bet wisely when no one can tell you the odds, and there's no way to calculate the odds when the game doesn't have rules. The game doesn't exist yet. When you play a game without a box, the risks become very real. When I wrote this essay, it was really important to me to prioritize defining what I think is an emerging phenomenon before passing judgment on it. And the reason that I was compelled to operate in that way is I think that so much of the dialogue that's happening now around NFTs and around cryptocurrencies and the metaverse and Web3 and all these other new emerging technologies really rushes to judgment of whether or not something is a good development or a bad development in a moral or ethical sense, in an economic sense, in a sense for justice or the environment. And I think that all those questions are incredibly important. But I also think that a lot of people are kind of getting tripped up because they're trying to formulate judgments about things before we know what they are. And I don't mean that to say, oh, the critics are uninformed and they just simply need to do their reading. And if only they understood the revolutionary potential, it's just all going to be so great. I'm not saying that. I'm not an NFT or a crypto evangelist really in any way. When I say that we don't have the terms, I don't mean that people are uninformed. I mean, literally, we haven't named what's happening. And so I think that we really need to work to come up with terminology for what's emerging in this space, delineate what's new from what's just kind of like a rehashed, repeated attempt at something that has already happened. And then once we do that, once we build language and descriptions for emergent phenomenon, then we can begin to assess what is it what's a good ectogame aesthetically? What's a good ectogame ethically, right? And so I don't fully get into that in this piece, and I think that those things intersect with all of the traditional critiques with NFTs and blockchain technology, from rampant financialization to environmental degradation and everything else. And so I think all those things need to be held together. But for me, what I think would serve everybody, including the harshest critics, is to come up with better language and better descriptions for what's emerging in this space, and really try to wrap our heads around it so that we can have critical conversations about where could we steer this? How could this be better? Where is this headed? Who is benefiting from the design decisions about these new forms? And how can we participate in that in a way that's positive and that's constructive, while also being critical? And so that's what I hope to do with this essay. And I thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to talk about it. And I encourage you to visit outland.art. I have other essays there that you can find, and there's other things that they're publishing every week that are really phenomenal. And I think it's really a great place for really substantive dialogue about a lot of these topics. Thanks.